Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari earlier today defended a currency swap that has sparked protests amid cash shortage in some urban centers across the country and ordered that the old issues of the 200 naira denomination be released back into circulation to ease the scarcity. The weeks-long cash crisis has intensified days before Nigerians are expected to vote in a presidential election to determine who will succeed President Buhari after his 2 terms in office. In an early morning nationwide broadcast, the president said he was moved by the hardship and pain people are currently facing over the cash crunch. He also said, and I quote, "To further ease the supply pressures, particularly to our citizens, I've given approval to the Central Bank of Nigeria that the old 200 bank notes be released back into circulation," end of quote. The policy has introduced redesigned 200, 500, and 1,000 naira notes. The old 200 naira bills will circulate as legal tender for 60 days until April the 10th, alongside the new currency notes. The president said that old 500 and 1,000 naira bills should henceforth be deposited with the central bank.
We reassure Nigerians that strengthening our economy, enhancing security, and blockage of leakages associated with illicit financial flows remain top priority of our administration. And I shall remain committed to my oath of protecting and advancing the interests of Nigerians and the nation at all times. In the last quarter of 2022, I authorized the Central Bank of Nigeria to redesign the 200 naira, 500 naira, and 1,000 naira Nigerian banknotes. For a smooth transition, I similarly approved that the redesigned banknotes should circulate concurrently with the old banknotes till 31st January 2023, before the old notes cease to be legal tender. In appreciation of the systemic and human difficulties encountered during implementation and in response to the appeal of all citizens, an extension of 10 days was authorized till 10th February 2023 for the completion of the process. All these activities are being carried out within the ambit of the Constitution, the relevant law under the CBN Act 2007, and in line with global best practices. Fellow citizens, while I seek your understanding and patience during this transient phase of implementation, I feel obliged to avail you a few critical points underpinning the policy decision. These include A, the need to restore the statutory ability of the CBN to keep a firm control over money in circulation. I am not unaware of the obstacles placed on the path of innocent Nigerians by unscrupulous officials in the banking industry, entrusted with the process of implementation of the new monetary policy. I am deeply pained and sincerely sympathize with you all over these unintended outcomes. To stem this tide, I have directed the CBN to deploy all legitimate resources and legal means to ensure that our citizens are adequately educated on the policy, enjoy easy access to cash withdrawal through availability of appropriate amount of currency and the ability to make deposits. I have similarly directed the CBN should intensify collaboration with anti-corruption agencies so as to ensure that any institution or persons found to have impeded or sabotaged the implementation should be made to bear the full weight of the law. During the extended phase of the deadline for currency swap, I listened to invaluable pieces of advice from well-meaning citizens and institutions across the nation. I similarly consulted widely with representatives of the state governors as well as the Council of State. Above all, as an administration that respects the rule of law, I have also noted that the subject matter is before the courts of our land and some pronouncements have been made. To further ease the supply pressures, particularly to our citizens, I have given approval to the CBN that the old 200 naira banknotes be released back into circulation, and that it should also be allowed to circulate as legal tender with the new 200 naira, 500 naira, and 1,000 naira banknotes for 60 days from February 10th, 2023 to April 10th, 2023, when the old 200 naira notes ceases to be legal tender.
Well, in the meantime, President Buhari is currently meeting with members of the House of Representatives ad hoc committee investigating the new Naira policy implemented by the Central Bank of Nigeria. Thursday's meeting, which started a few minutes after noon, comes hours after the president, in a televised message, announced the extension of the legal tender status of only the old 200 Naira note for a period of 60 days. We're now being joined by a RISE analyst, Frank Tietie, and Professor Bongo of Lagos Business School, and we will examine the president's announcement against the backdrop of the ongoing litigation by some state governments at the Supreme Court. It's great to have you both. Frank, we'll go straight to you. And let's get started. All right, Frank Tietie, we'll get started with you. Now, let's first look at this from the lens of democracy, because that seems to be one of the key topics of conversation. Of course, we heard the president talking about respecting the rule of law and acknowledging that there's a process ongoing in the Supreme Court as it stands. However, under the lens of democracy and the rule of law, how democratic is it for the president to issue an executive order that seems to be contrary to a process that is ongoing in the Supreme Court?
Thank you, and that's quite undemocratic. That is contrary to the principle of forming a republic that we have in Nigeria, known as the Federal Republic of Nigeria. The president's intervention comes with some relief on the grounds that it is responsive by a sort of a compassionate fatherly figure over the country, but becomes very worrisome, threatens the very foundation upon which our legal order is built. The president made allusion to the fact that he was doing, or the pronouncement he made was in line with the oath of office, where he promised that he would do everything to promote the interest of Nigeria. He should have also extended it that the oath of office mandated him to do everything possible to uphold the tenets of the Nigerian Constitution, which is separation of powers. The Federal Republic of Nigeria connotes the fact that the citizens own the sovereignty of this country, but they have their will expressed through representatives in the National Assembly and by a very strong personality having immense powers in the president, but with both of those branches of government being checked by the interpretation of the Constitution by the courts, in this case, the Supreme Court. Section 6, Section 287, Section 235, all attest to the finality of the pronouncement, not necessarily judgment, pronouncements of the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court has made a pronouncement in a form of interim order that it is yet to vacate, the president cannot, in the interest of democracy, now further interpret and subject whatever the Supreme Court has said to further modification. It is not sending the right message for democracy. It is saying that the Supreme Court is not supreme or superior, that the presidential order, which is meant to establish, which is meant to fulfill the Constitution by ensuring that whatever proceeds from the Supreme Court is implemented, is enforced by the president himself. But in this case, he is the one that is disregarding that pronouncement for the Constitution. It is very worrisome, not only for lawyers, but for anybody who cares about the public order and the legal tradition that we have in Nigeria that makes it, that guarantees peace, good governance, and the well-being of Nigerians.
Thank you so much, Frank. We can confirm now that Professor Adi Bongo of the Lagos Business School is with us. Professor, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday. Now, my question to you is, with the fact that the 200 Naira notes, you know, the old tender, it continues to be the legal tender until April the 10th. I'm wondering if you think that this might create a loophole regarding the president's aspirations for a free, fair, and credible election, because one of the reasons for this policy being introduced, from what we understood in the beginning, was to make sure that there would not be there wouldn't be cases of prevalent vote buying. So I'm wondering, with this introduction of this revision, do you think that this might actually create a loophole?
Well, thank you very much, Cynthia, for having me. I think it's just a reprieve. I wouldn't say it is a revision. It isn't a revision, but kind of a momentary reprieve. And it is all desirable because of what people are going through all over the nation in different parts of Nigeria. We also have to appreciate the fact that, the infrastructure, the financial infrastructure is not that efficient, and it's also not hasn't penetrated to many rural parts of Nigeria. There are some places also that do not have, significant banking presence, meaning that people will really find it difficult to get access to the new, currency notes. And we've seen that. And that is what is fueling this upheaval that people started to, emotions are boiling over and they're beginning to take the law into their hands. So this is a momentary reprieve that the president, is giving to people. So, it might create a little bit of a loophole in the sense that, no matter what, there are so many ways to induce voters. There should be non-pecuniary ways of vote inducement, non-monetary, so it's not just by cash. So no matter what we do, I don't think that we can totally eliminate vote buying. Even in other cultures, in other countries, I'm sure that there are so many ways that politicians of influence will induce people to vote for them. So we can't totally eliminate that, but really, by the president not, totally revising the policy means that the policy will still be effective, but definitely, it is important to save lives. It is important to save infrastructure and the banks and the property of banks. It is important to save all of this by granting this reprieve for the moment. So I don't think that will change anything. In fact, I would expect that even the president should be more considerate, because people are really suffering. He acknowledged the fact that the hardship that people are experiencing was unanticipated. So, these are some of the unintended consequences that arise when you have this kind of policies. I have heard people saying that the policy is not backed by any sort of empirical evidence, so they are just being draconian and all of that. But I won't subscribe to that view because I know why. Because I've actually studied this. Because again, the president his presentation, his address this morning was quite lucid and comprehensive. It addresses all the issues. I like the fact that he connected, the reason for this currency redesign to reining in inflation. And of course, inflation is something that happens when the velocity of money is too high. But then, if you look at the data, on the facial value of the data, you will be tempted to conclude that the velocity of money in circulation is very low. In fact, data show that over the past decade, the velocity of money has not gone beyond 1. So it's just 1. I mean, what do we mean by velocity? The rate at which money changes hands. So if you have an economy that has the GDP of, say, 200 naira, and then you have money supply that is just 10 naira, it means that the average naira note will have to, move around about 20 times. Okay, so that is what it means. So, and that is high. Now, if you look at the currency in circulation, the president said that they have about 3-point-something trillion currency, that's cash. But then out of that, what is within the central bank control is just 500 billion, meaning that 2.7 trillion lie outside the banking, the central bank control. And then in the interim, in the few days that this policy has been rolled out, they've been able to mop back into the system about 2.1 trillion. So that means that even the data that we had, because we computed the velocity based on the cash that is lying outside the banking system based on data, but without information on what actually the bank has access to, which is just 500 billion. So if we revise our analysis and look at recompute the velocity of money, so it will be the case that the velocity is not actually 1, it may be more than 20, which actually is a recipe for high inflation. So I think for all intent and purposes, this one, the government got it right.
Professor Adibongo, thank you so much for looking at the economic indices, because that's where I'd like to take this conversation next. One of the biggest case studies of demonetization in the world is, of course, the case of India in 2016. And we know that it yielded similar results. There was a liquidity crisis and there were protests, and the Supreme Court of India also got involved. Now, following this, however, a few years down the line, Prime Minister Narendra Modi of India is celebrated as, analysts say it was a masterstroke of genius by him, because he was able to tackle corruption, and the formalization of the Indian economy is largely attributed to that demonetization policy. Now, I'd like to throw this to both of you, but let me start with you, Frank. Do you think that history will be kind to President Buhari in 5 years, as we've seen in the case of India, that in the short term it was a painful policy, but the mid to long term results resulted in a more organized and formalized economy that also had an increased employment rate?
Oh, well, I think we're already having a date with history with President Muhammadu Buhari, considering that this is a policy he had tinkered with before in his first coming as a military head of state, when he, in the same vein of tackling corruption, had introduced for the Naira change. I still recall snippets of the situation at that time under the military. It was swift. It did tackle corruption. We had sensational cases of monies that were stored in beer cartons and that it was difficult to return, and which eventually, some of which were confiscated. That was quite brutal at that time. But if we look beyond this moment, the excruciating pains that Nigerians are going through at this time, many of them who don't understand what is actually going on, who see this whole decision as being political, especially because it's so close to the election, and others thinking that it's a form of interference in the electoral process. If it is, there is a basis for it, because the Electoral Act does criminalize things like vote buying. And if an unusual excess liquidity would aid vote buying, a responsible executive would want to do something. But whether it is doing it well, it's a problem. Given the protestations and the protests actually that have greeted this policy and the untold hardship being foisted on Nigerians now, it has to just work. But to also think about the many somersaults, the many shifts in dates, and to also think that there is no coherence in the plan, to also implement it in a seamless manner, to think that a policy can be so frustrated by third parties like ordinary bank officials, and then to also continue the blame game of making the politicians the scapegoat, shows that there is some poor planning. So I doubt how it turns out, but to also think that the president has responded may be some relief, but becomes very, very worrisome for legal historians that this administration of President Muhammadu Buhari has seen too many instances of disregard and disobedience to court orders. So talking about history, I doubt if it will be kind as the situation presently is right now.
Thank you. Professor Eddie Bongo, from an economic perspective?
Well, yes, I think history will be kind to the president. In fact, if this is the only thing he left as a legacy, I think it will be worth it. One of the challenges that we've had in the economy, in the society over the past number of years, is this increase in internal, we'll call it terrorism, kidnapping for ransom, and all manner of insecurity, which has actually contributed to the lower record in GDP and output growth that we have over these years. There are still some segments of this country that are inaccessible, that are not part of the economic system because of insecurity. So, and what has fueled that has been the ease at which people can get access to these illicit funds. So this is actually a master stroke that renders that disincentivize such kind of illicit transactions. So people will no longer kidnap for monetary compensation, for ransom any longer, and then making transactions very transparent will reduce corruption to the barest minimum. And this is something that we need to rein in the economy right now. And then if you also follow and then listen to people who are actually decrying the policy and then, shouting all over the place, you will see that they are basically politicians who, they've amassed so much cash here and there. I mean, typical Nigerians, workers, civil servants, and other people, employees, do not keep cash. I mean, they keep their monies in the banks, and then they transact through digital and electronic channels. If you go to other countries as well, you notice that Nigeria seems to be, a little bit backward when it comes to electronic financial transactions. Even Kenya has M-Pesa that has been rolled out every dick and Harry. If you travel all over the world, it's not because these people are more literate or more educated than Nigerians. They are not. But it's just simply because they are willing to, adopt technology. So technology adoption is quite low in Nigeria. So what some people do not like is this kind of dictatorial approach to it. So it becomes kind of draconian. That people have to be forced, to do it within a very short time frame, which is creating all these bottlenecks. But again, if you know how Nigerians, how we behave as human beings, you know that we normally respond to the language of force. And I think that is what will push people, change that incentive. I think altogether, in the medium to long term, this is a good policy that will lay the foundation for the creation of a credit economy rather than this cash-based system. And when you have a cash system such as we have, that's always prone to high price, very quick, rapid jump in prices that we find with inflation. So it's highly inflationary. So, but when we begin to adopt a credit-based system, cash will become less of in demand, and all of that. It will encourage the build-up of credit. Of course, we said that credit is capital, and then we will begin to see a different spot of economic growth. I'm sure that if this policy, if we allow it to be carried out to the letter, it will really add to our to output growth in the long term. But then another issue is about enforcement, because it's one thing to roll out policy, but do we have the enforcement capacity to ensure that it's implemented to the letter? Because it's just like the CBN, handing out the new currencies to the banks, but unknown to them, the banks had their own incentives. So, I don't know because I don't have the evidence, but that's what we've read in the papers, that banks kept the monies, the notes, they were not releasing it to the public because they're working in collaboration with some politicians or something. So those are some of the human elements, with respect to any sort of public policy. So whether it works depends on the enforcement capacity of the institutions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Now back to you, Frank. You mentioned something earlier on that definitely caught my interest. You mentioned poor planning. That is apparent in this case. In terms of implementation, I think we've seen poor execution. Right now, Nigerians aspire for the bare minimum, to be able to purchase their food, to be able to transport themselves from one point to the other. I'd like to know from your perspective, if you've seen as all the loopholes or in terms of implementation, how would you have executed this policy to have made it less painful and probably successful? If you could give a step-by-step pointer of what you would have done, how you would have started this policy and implemented it, or how would things have been done from your perspective, if possible?
First and foremost, I would do everything possible to get enough time and to carry out a sort of public education to the extent of making the public to own the policy itself. The policy should not be seen as that of a government to the people, but that of the Federal Republic of Nigeria for its own interest and for the interest of the people. People are driven with, are more motivated positively by self-interest. Again, our legal system that we practice here is a combination of the command approach of a very powerful commander issuing orders to lower subjects to obey and comply with. We combine it with the historical approach, that is, a people must see the value of any law given to them as a reflection of their own culture, the historical approach. So when Nigerians must, first of all, see it as in their own interest. The president may, in his own wisdom, acting in the interest of Nigeria, but many Nigerians, as we speak, do not see it that way. They actually see it as a form of targeting one personality and then in favor of another person. Other pundits look at it as electoral intervention. Then I will move on to ensuring that it is about, not only curbing vote buying, but to ensure that we have a stable economy that does not fly off the wheel or the control of the central bank, which again is seen that is acting in the overall interest of the people. So the actual problem of the implementation here has to do with timing and communication. Now, enough time will give the bank to expand their infrastructure. As we speak, many banks are overwhelmed. Some of their systems have been shut down for days because they were not adequately prepared. Now, this sort of time needed for preparation is not only applicable to banks, but also applicable to the minting factory, the official minting factory. Now, you cannot dispel and easily discard the pieces of information that we have that the mint doesn't even have enough capacity to print the needed threshold of funds required to drive this large economy that we proudly have. So we are not turning our strength to our gains, but it's now becoming a problem because we're unable to meet. We lack the capacity to meet the needs that we have. So in addition to timing and poor communication, we have to now bring the patriotic element to it. Now, politicians must not always have ability to have loopholes, to exploit loopholes in any policy. Again, you will also proceed to get the buy-in of the courts. The courts this is one thing we must understand. Courts don't have specialized knowledge. What they care about most times are interpretation of the law and then rights of parties. So whenever anybody sufficiently creates a state of emergency before any court, particularly if superior courts of record, the first thing they do is to maintain status quo, which effectively stalls the whole process and whatever good intentions that are attached to it. So when you are about to do something very cataclysmic, however good it may be for the overall interest of Nigerians, get the buy-in of the major stakeholders that are capable of actually truncating it. The court's very important. So right. What stopped the CPN from approaching the court to make declarations against the major parties, the states? Because first and foremost, it can elicit the intention of the state by throwing it to them that we will intend to do this, that, and that. Right. And then it can elicit and know whether they buy into it or not, and then get a legal support before it proceeds. Right. These things the central bank did not do actually affected it greatly in the implementation process of this policy.
Well, thank you for your enlightening views, Rise analyst Frank Tietie and Professor of Lagos Business School, Professor Adi Bongo. We thank you so much for your time today.